It's day 5 of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers, and today we get a look at what might be the best creature land from the new cycle, and maybe the best Stuffy Doll commander ever. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So we kind of get a light day today. It's the weekend, spoilers keep rolling out, but not as many as during the week, but we still have some sweet stuff to talk about. A pretty cool new rat, a really good creature land, an amazing burn commander, which means we should probably jump into it, start talking sweet new Wilds of Eldraine cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Wilds of Eldraine. First up today, we got the Boros creature land, and it's actually a really good one in Restless Bivouac. So Restless Bivouac, Boros Manor, ETB taps, 3 mana, becomes a 2/2 red and white Ox creature token. It's still land, and when it attacks, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is essentially a mini Boros Raging Ravine. There was a time when Raging Ravine was a 4-of staple in the best deck in Modern Jund. Times have changed, the years have went by, but I still think that Restless Bivouac, this has to be a great standard land, right? Like, it looks like Raging Ravine, a former Modern All-Star. Yeah, it starts a little smaller, but it's also cheaper to activate, which is an upside, especially in a Boros deck, which can be pretty aggressive. So again, like most of these creature lands, I'm not really expecting these to be non-standard staples. Maybe like Pioneer/Explorer in some cases, but really I think the time of tapped creature lands being all-stars in Modern or Legacy or whatever, that time's just gone. The formats are too powerful, too fast for these lands, but in Standard, I expect these lands to be really good, and I would argue that Restless Bivouac might be the best of the bunch. I think this is my current rating. We're still missing one. There's one still to come, but I think that Restless Bivouac is number 1. It's cheap to activate, it grows itself, or it can grow other things, and it has some synergies. Restless Spire probably number 2, just because it's the cheapest to activate, even though its body isn't big. And then you got Restless Cottage, Restless Fortress, which are good. They're just 4 to activate, which is kind of asking a lot. I think they're fine, and I still think they're very good in Standard, but I would say Restless Bivouac is probably number 1. And remember, we're in a Standard where there's actually some synergies for +1/+1 counters. We have just straight up +1/+1 counter stuff like Ozolith's Shattered Spire. Those decks are mostly green-white, but they could go into Naya. Our mana's really good, and we're talking about another dual land, so if you want to go into 3 colors, you can. Plus, remember, we also have Modify, and Restless Bivouac seems really nice in a deck that's built around Thundering Raju, Modify effects like that as well. So I think this card should be really good in Standard, and it's just a really efficient land that looks like a former Modern All-Star. We also got a new 2-drop rat in Tangled Colony. So a 2-mana 3/2, it's a rat. It says Tangled Colony can't block. I call these hardened creatures, all offense, no defense. And then when it dies, you make X 1/1 black rat creature tokens. With this creature can't block, where X is the amount of damage dealt to it this turn. So Tangled Colony, it's pretty interesting. It kind of reminds me of like Black Feldon. We've seen Feldon be really good in Standard. Yes, it can't block, but if you're playing an aggro deck, you don't really want to be blocking with your 2-drop anyway. You want to be attacking with it. In Feldon, eventually, you get your opponent's life total low enough that they're gonna have to block it, and then you get to draw some cards essentially, or a card out of a bunch of cards. Tangled Colony is kind of the same. If you're aggressive enough, yes, not being able to block is annoying, but you get your opponent low enough on life that sooner or later they gotta block it with a shielded or something. Your Tangled Colony takes 4 damage, it dies, you get 4 rats, then you get to keep swinging in with those rats to close out the game. So I think this card is very interesting to me. The big question for this in Standard is we got a lot of good black 2-drops, like Misery Shadow, Tenacious Underdog, Razorlash, Transmogrant. If you're into Mirror, we got stuff like Lightning Sluter also entering the format. Can Tangled Colony beat out these cards to be a Standard staple? And I think it really depends on the deck. So if you're going big in your black deck and getting up to Shieldreds or Beseech the Multiverses, kind of playing a more mid-rangey plan, I think Tangled Colony loses a lot of value. In a deck like that, I probably wouldn't play it. Where I think this is going to shine the most is the equivalent of the mono red deck but in black, where you're playing like all 1-drops and 2-drops, trying to get your opponent's life total low as quickly as possible, where you can force your opponent into eventually having to make a bad block and then getting a bunch of rats out of this. So if you're a super aggro black deck, This might actually be one of the best 2-drops in the format, but if you're more mid-rangey, it loses a lot of its value. What I'm most hyped for with this card, though, is actually using it as a combo piece. So if you read its ability carefully, you make X rat tokens, where X is the amount of damage it took during the turn where it died. So this kind of combos like Stuffy Doll in a weird way. It's like a Stuffy Doll that instead of dealing damage, it makes a bunch of tokens. So if you cast a Blasphemous Act, let's say, you're gonna get 13 rats. If you cast a Star of Extinction, you're gonna get 20 rats. So imagine just like wrathing the board and having a ton of rats left over to close out the game. That actually seems like a kind of realistic plan. We even have Ill-Tempered Loner in Standard still, which kind of cares about the same thing. So maybe we can build some deck that's like, imagine City on Fire to triple damage, and then like Stone Splitter Bolt, bargain to double up that damage, and then also triple it with City on Fire. You're just gonna make all the rats in the world. So this is probably, or actually definitely, like an against the odds plan, but it would be really funny when it works. So Tangled Colony, I like this card. I think this is a card that really good in super aggressive decks, has some weird combo potential, although it probably doesn't make it in the tier like Dimir mid-range or mono black mid-range style black decks. We also got a spicy new legend in Imodane the Pyrohammer. So when I first read this card, I was kind of like, yeah, all right, sure, whatever. But I've really come around on this being a super cool commander. A standard, that's another story. So 4 mana 4/4 legendary human knight. It says whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control that targets only a single creature deals damage to that creature, Imodane deals that much damage to each opponent. So on level 1, this essentially turns your lightning strikes into searing blazes. You lightning strike your opponent's creature. You also get to send that damage at your opponent's face, or at each opponent's face, technically, if you're playing Commander. In Standard, I'm pretty skeptical this was going to be good enough. When Sulfum first released, I built a Sulfum burn deck, and Sulfum seems like ridiculous in a burn deck. It just like doubles up your non-combat damage. It seems absurd. It can become indestructible. And it turned out that Sulfum was like the worst card in the deck as a 4-drop that you need to untap with and have mana to cast spells to get value out of it. It was just way too slow for burn. So if Sulfum isn't good enough for a standard burn deck, I would be surprised if Imodane is. Like, they kind of feel very similar to me, except I'd argue that Sulfum is probably just better for the most part. So standard, I'm not especially high on this card, although if you want to play it against the odd style, there are some interesting ways to take advantage of this. So one of the quirks of Magic is burn that only can hit creatures is usually pretty efficient, because Wizards doesn't want you to be able to just burn your opponent out of the game directly for a few mana. We talked about Stone Splitter Bolt already. Like, that's a pretty appealing target for an Imodane deck in Standard. You can bargain it to double it up, and for like 5 mana you're dealing 10 damage or something, and just absolutely wiping your opponent out. As you go back to older formats, there's stuff that like deals damage equal to the number of lands you control, or the number of creatures you control, or Harvest Fire. You exile X cards from your graveyard and deal that much damage to a creature. These are all effects that Wizards doesn't let hit players, because it would just be too easy to kill your opponent. Like, it's too easy to get 20 lands on the battlefield, or 20 creatures on the battlefield, or 20 cards in your graveyard. But with Imodane, all these cards technically can kill your opponent. Like, you just target whatever creature's on the battlefield, hit it for 20 with Harvest Fire, throw that at your opponent's face and close out the game. So I don't think this is gonna like be a legit thing in Modern or whatever, but it does seem like a really cool challenge to pull off. Once you get to Commander, there are some really weird, strange combos that turn this card into essentially a one-shot kill with like a lightning bolt, or in some cases even a gut shot. So the easiest is Radiate. So how this works is, let's say there's 10 creatures on the battlefield in a game of Commander. You lightning bolt one of those creatures, so you're casting an instant or sorcery that only targets a single creature, and then you cast Radiate to essentially make a lightning bolt hit everything else, all the rest of the creatures. In a really weird way, this makes Imodane like kind of busted. So you're gonna have a lightning bolt going at each of 10 creatures. That's 30 total damage being dealt to creatures by a single spell that only targeted one thing. So Imodane is going to deal 30 damage to everyone. Plus, I guess Radiate makes the bolts at your opponents. So that's kind of the most powerful thing to do with Imodane, I think. It's kind of like this weird burn combo commander. You can also do the same thing with Zada. Zada's a little more restricted because it only cares about your creatures, but if you make like a bunch of tokens, play a Zada, play an Imodane, lightning bolt your Zada, you're going to do the same thing. Your single targeted spell is going to actually target all of your things. Imodane's going to see all those creatures being dealt 3 damage, and then you add all that damage up, throw it at all your opponents. And remember, we're talking about lightning bolt here, which is like one of the best constructed burn spells, but if you're just trying to deal a bunch of damage to your own creatures or to all the creatures, there are way more efficient ways, like we were talking about before. Like, imagine a Harvest Pyre that's dealing 10 damage and then hitting every creature. You're not dealing 30 damage, you're dealing like 100 damage to everyone with 10 creatures on the battlefield. So I actually think this might be a really powerful, strange kind of combo burn commander. This might be the best Stuffy Doll commander. Like, if you want to build a Stuffy Doll deck, and Stuffy Doll decks are super fun, where you're just trying to damage your own stuff, Imodane seems perfect for that. Those synergies we were just talking about with Radiate, with Zada, they get even better when you have something like Stuffy Doll or Brash Taunter to throw even more damage around as you're throwing these spells at your creatures. So Imodane, not really high on this being a standard card. Maybe a cool against the odds card because of some of those combos we were talking about where we can set up situations where one spell hitting a creature actually just kills the opponent from 20. But in Commander, there's some really sneaky tricks that actually make this a pretty exciting burner Stuffy Doll style commander that actually might end up being pretty powerful. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards, I got 3 cards to mention individually today. Twisted Soorwitch, 5 mana 3/4 human warlock. When it ETBs, you make a 1/1 black rat creature token that can't block. More importantly, for each rat you control, you create a wicked roll, which will give it +1/+1, and when the aura goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses a life. So at 5 mana, this might not be enough. If you think about it, it's 5 mana for a 3/4 and a 2/2 that can't block, that when it dies, you deal a damage. That's not that far away from being constructed playable. The reason to be hyped about this, I think, is in a dedicated rat deck. In a rat deck, we've seen that you can make a lot of rat tokens pretty easily. Since they're just 1/1s that can't block, they're priced really aggressively. Like Redcap Gutter Dweller makes 2, Tangled Colony can make a ton. So in a deck that can get 5 or 10 rat tokens on the battlefield, then this card actually becomes kind of interesting. You make them all 2/2s, you swing with them, even if your opponent can block them, they're going to take damage from the roll going to the graveyard. So I don't know, maybe some sort of like budget rat deck in standard. Again, I would be surprised. Like, again, we're in a standard with like Shieldred and busted black cards, so I don't think this is like a new constructed staple or anything, but I do think this is like close enough that in a dedicated rat deck it might actually be playable. We also got Harried Spearguard, a 1 mana 1/1 human soldier with haste that when it dies you make a 1/1 black rat creature token that can't block. This one is worth mentioning just because it's essentially like Doom Traveler or Grim Initiate. 1 mana 1/1s that make a 1/1 when they die have shown to be pretty powerful in sacrifice-based decks, and we have a lot of sack synergies in standard. Like, it's really good to casually Ob Nixilis. It's great for bargaining. You can sack it to your Rankler, Torbrand, or Braids. So as just a standalone mono red threat, I'd be surprised if it made it, although haste does help a little bit there. But in a deck that can take advantage of the fact that this is 2 bodies for 1 mana since you're sacrificing them or whatever, Harried Spearguard, much like some of the previous versions that we talked about, might end up actually being a very strong card. We also got Royal Treatment. So 1 grade mana instant, target creature you control gains hexproof until undeterred. Create a Royal Roll token attached to that. And the Royal Roll is +1/+1 in Ward 1. So +1/+1 and a little bit of protection moving forward in the future. So Royal Treatment, I think it's not that far away of being a constructed playable protection spell. The problem is, we're in a standard with Tyver Stand, and Tyver Stand is, I think, just the best version of this effect that we've ever seen. Like, the fact that Tyver Stand is 1 mana, protect your thing with hexproof and indestructible, and then later in the game is like, dump all your mana into it, hopefully Voltron kill your opponent with this big pump spell, that just makes it better. So I don't think you're going to replace your Tyver Stance with Royal Treatments, but there is an exception. If your deck really cares about having auras on the battlefield, then Royal Treatment might actually be better, even though it's worse in a vacuum. So maybe you're like an Area deck, being able to 1 mana give your area hexproof, and then in the future ward 1 with a roll, and just add an aura to the battlefield so you're draining with area on your end step. That might actually be worth it. So keep this in mind. I think in just a generic mono green deck, Tyver Stand's going to be better, but if your deck really cares about just the number of auras or enchantments on the battlefield, then Royal Treatment, even though it's worse overall, might just be the better option for your deck. Of course, we also got some random draft chaff, which you can check it all out over on MTGPreviews.com. Finally today, we got 3 Enchanted Tales. So this is Leyline of Sanctity, just gives you hexproof, comes into play for free at the beginning of the game if it's in your opening hand. Already printed everywhere, but a good reprint with cool art. We also got 2 new to Arena Enchanted Tales today. The first one, Force Fruition. The second one is Utopia Sprawl, which is, you probably know from Modern, just 1 green mana, enchant a forest, and it lets that land tap for an additional mana of a color of your choice. So Force Fruition, I think this is mostly a meme card. Like, it's a fine commander reprint. It's something that I never really see anyone play, but it has a unique effect where whenever opponent casts a spell, they draw 7 cards, which could lead to a funny against the odds deck in like Historic with Shieldred or Bowmasters. I don't know if you can actually, in good faith, build an against the odds deck around Shieldred and Bowmasters, but the idea of like stacking up a couple of those and playing Force Fruition, and whenever your opponent casts a spell, they have to draw 7 cards and they just like die to the damage from Bowmasters and Shieldred. It actually sounds kind of funny. On the other hand, I'm actually just legit worried about Utopia Sprawl coming to Arena. Utopia Sprawl is like a Modern staple. It's a 1 mana dork, assuming you have a forest, except it doesn't really die to anything. It doesn't die to creature removal, it doesn't die to Bowmasters, and we've already seen Mono Green Devotion be a very strong deck in Historic, and it already plays Wolfwillowhaven, which is just like a more expensive, worst version than Utopia Sprawl. Yes, I know it can make a wolf or whatever, but that's not why you're playing it. So this is just like, turn 1 I play this, turn 2 I can Kiora, turn 2 I can play my Old Girl Troll, my Pelucranos. So I think this is just a new staple in Green Devotion decks, and it'll probably see play outside of there. If you look at Modern, a lot of decks just play this as their mana dork because they don't want their mana dork to die to Orcish Bowmasters. So I think easy staple in Green Devotion decks, but I expect this to be a card we'll be seeing a ton of in Historic because it's just a really powerful way to ramp you. Although it is worth pointing out, it's going to be a little worse in a lot of decks in Historic just because we don't have fetch lands. So Mono Green Devotion for now, but once we have cons and fetch lands and you can fetch out a shock land on turn 1 and then put this on it, I think we're going to see this be a hugely impactful staple level card in Historic on Magic Arena. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Throne of Eldraine spoilers for today. So kind of a light little weekend day as we get ready for next week and wrapping up spoiler season. But let me know what you think about today's cards. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow or maybe Monday, depending on how many spoilers we get, with more Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the video where we talked about the plays that actually forced Wizards to change the very rules of Magic.